Hi, everyone. I'm Tiffany Iselhart, a public historian specializing in researching and interpreting childhood. Specifically, I focus on the study of girlhood throughout all time periods. I've worked with lots of museums, and in the past decade, I've discovered that girlhood, and childhood in general, are much more diverse, complex, and interesting than most scholars tend to believe. Today, we're talking about childhood in the early modern period, which followed the Middle Ages, or medieval period. It began roughly around 1450 CE and lasted to about 1815. Like other times, the early modern was experienced in a variety of ways based on where and who you were. The common threads are the rise of modern states, exploration and colonization of the Americas by European nations, the transition to industrialization, and various intellectual and religious movements such as the Scientific Revolution, the Protestant Reformation, and the Enlightenment. Yeah, that's a lot for 350 years. Rather than tackle it all, this module will explore three areas that help us understand how rapid and contested these changes were in Europe and colonial America: education, play, and slavery. One of the first sources for our understanding is the large legacy of written works left by philosophers, scientists, and in various journals, diaries, and literature. Emerging from the medieval and Renaissance worlds came the Enlightenment school of thought. These philosophies emphasized reason and individualism, with works by big names such as John Locke and Isaac Newton. Exploring their thoughts could take an entire course in itself, but the Enlightenment's thoughts on childhood are well summed up by one big name: Shakespeare. In Richard III, Shakespeare's Queen Elizabeth tells a cardinal not to repeat sensitive information in front of young princes because, quote, "pitchers have ears." According to Michael Whitmore of Carnegie Mellon University, what the Queen means is that children gather up what they hear and then repeat that information in inappropriate situations. Now, while this paints an image of children squawking like parrots, it does ring true in one aspect. The Enlightenment increasingly recognized children's capacity for soaking up knowledge. In order to cultivate this capacity properly, Enlightenment thinkers advocated for children, mostly white children, to be educated. This view was also cultivated by the religious movement of Protestantism, begun when Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to a church door in Wittenberg, Germany in 1517. Connected by the common belief of purifying the Roman Catholic Church of corruption, the various Protestant religious sects involved children as one of their prime targets, given children's capacity to soak up reformed ideas and religious practices. Notably, Luther argued that both boys and girls should be educated through compulsory attendance and coeducational schools. These beliefs impacted education, which slowly began turning into what we now recognize as modern educational systems. Adoption of these models progressed in stages, happening at different times throughout the Western world. Establishment of schools often depended on the local people. It was funded by them or through endowments. And despite philosophical advocacy towards education of girls, the standard of full education for boys and domestic education for girls was largely the norm, upheld in the first stage of schooling, home or dame schools. This meant that the next stage, grammar schools, were largely reserved for middle and upper class boys, especially those whom parents hoped would attend university. However, few poor children attended because their labor was economically valuable to their families. Thus, poor children were more likely to be apprenticed, but even these became more standardized. In 1563 in England, childhood apprenticeships had become so common that the nation implemented standardized terms of service at 7 years, and even attempted to regulate child welfare by ensuring that masters treated their apprentices with justice, kindness, and love, according to historian M.J. Tucker. Notably, indentures were used to help populate the American colonies. Oftentimes, young men and women would enter into contracts of indentured servitude, exchanging a certain number of years of their labor for transport to and housing in the colonies. This helped lower and middle class people immigrate to America while providing a source of labor for emerging farms and cities. Once freed, indentured servants were typically provided with money, land, or household goods in order to set up their own homes in America. While more typical for teenagers or young adults, some families did indenture young children as a way to relieve financial burdens and give their children a hopefully better life. Despite this seeming adherence to the norm, the early modern period was the first time that society seriously considered female education in terms of its ability as an emancipatory, rationalizing force that would help girls become independent thinkers and individuals. Even with all the wars, religious dissent, and industrialization happening, or perhaps because of them, Western society was finally starting to debate whether girls constituted full persons who should have equal rights. Obviously, we're still having that debate, but hey, it was a start. That isn't to say that a focus on domestic education was bad. Many educational systems continued to confine girls to home and family life, but even there, we see indications that girls were learning skills that could extend beyond the domestic sphere. In exploring American girlhood in 50 Historic Treasures, we recount the story of Mary Wright, who created this sampler around 1754. Samplers had been used since the medieval period as a reference and practice tool for stitches, but in the 1700s they took on a distinct role in the education of girls. In 1754, Mary Wright embroidered this sampler while attending boarding school in Newport, Rhode Island. At first glance, it seems to be a simple embroidery of a spring day, including a girl, bunnies, and butterflies. However, samplers are much more complex and layered than they appear. Mary completed this sampler as a mark of her accomplishments and readiness to run a household, as well as her adherence to middle class values. It reflected many trends in the American colonies. First, the population was booming, growing from 629,000 to over 5 million in just 100 years. And the growth was mostly centered on eastern seaports like Mary's home of Newport. Second, this boom and growing Atlantic world trade created a new middle class, one that was prosperous and ambitious. They wanted their children to be better educated, both to achieve financial success, but also to make better marriages. For girls, this meant more than just the basics of literacy and arithmetic. Mary needed to learn music, dancing, painting, needlework, religion, literature, grammar, and geography in order to either attract a good husband or, should she not marry, to become self sustaining. Her samplers demonstrated mastery of these skills and were hung proudly on the wall of her parents' home. Yet this sampler also tells us something about Mary. In depicting butterflies and rabbits, choosing the colors of the thread, and placing herself within the picture, she provided insight into her personal tastes and how she might prefer to decorate her home. Looking at the collection of her later embroidered works held by the Winterthur Museum, including chair covers, pocket books, and pictures, as well as a roundabout chair held by Yale University Art Gallery, her preference for bright, springtime colors becomes evident. Now, it wasn't all work and school. Like in the medieval period, play remained an important part of childhood. In the early part of this period, one type of play became preferred, that which fostered theatrical skills. Children's theatre companies thrived around London in the late 1500s and early 1600s, such as the companies of St. Paul's and the Blackfriars Theatre, which played before paying audiences. Children who were part of choir schools were often drafted for these companies, with their income supplementing funds set aside for their education and maintenance by royal patrons. Basically, being part of a theatre company was a good way for children to experience social mobility early in life. One such child actress was Miss Rose de Francete, born around 1764. At the age of 5, she made her theatrical debut playing the title role in Tom Thumb, shown here, at the Haymarket Theatre, and later played the Duke of York in Shakespeare's Richard III. However, the age of child prodigies like Rose was often reduced to claim they were younger than they were. Was it possible a 5 or 6-year-old could play such complex characters as Tom Thumb or the Duke of York? Little is known of what became of Rose, as it was revealed in 1777 that Miss Rose was a fictional name. Rose's last known appearance was in 1779, at which point she seems to disappear from the historical record. Children also still played at home. The variety and number of toys manufactured steadily increased, with new types of toys such as the first jigsaw puzzle in 1767, the rocking horse, and even blowing bubbles from leftover washing soap. This was also the first time that board games were mass-produced. Similar to modern board games, players typically use dice to land on different spaces. Now, you may think we've covered things well, but there's one very important set of voices we haven't addressed: enslaved children. During the early modern period, the Atlantic slave trade was in full swing, resulting in vast forced movements of entire Black and Indigenous populations throughout the western part of the world. Unfortunately, very few voices of enslaved children survive, especially ones that we can accept as fully realistic in depictions of their lives. But enslaved children did manage to gain national, even international attention. In exploring American girlhood in 50 Historic Treasures, Chapter 10 recounts one of the most famous enslaved girls of colonial America, Phyllis Wheatley, whose poetry became popular among the upper classes of America and Europe and was even published, but whose life is ultimately tragic in that she never saw the profits from the sale of her books. It was all kept by her owners, the Wheatleys. Yet Phyllis wasn't the first enslaved girl to publish her works. The earliest known publication is Bar's Fight, a ballad by Lucy Terry. Lucy was taken captive in Africa in the 1720s or 1730s and sold to Ebenezer Wells of Massachusetts. She composed Bar's Fight in response to a Native American raid on the town of Deerfield, where she lived. Lucy was likely 14 or 16 at the time when she composed this in 1756 and became an orator, poet, and abolitionist. In the 1780s, when a local white man tried to steal the prince's property, Lucy argued her land case to the Supreme Court and ultimately won. Unfortunately, none of her speeches or writings beyond Bar's Fight have survived. However, we must bear in mind that Phyllis and Lucy's experiences were not the norm for enslaved children. Scholars are only now delving deep into enslaved childhood, cobbling together sources, many taken with a grain of salt, to piece together their experiences, both triumphant and tragic. One source of slavery that discusses childhood is the interesting narrative of the life of Velada Aquiano, or Gustavus Vasa, the African, originally published in 1772. This autobiography includes Aquiano's account of his kidnapping from the charming, fruitful vale named Isaka in Africa at the age of 11. After being sold to British traders, he was held on the West African coast and loaded onto a slave ship. His description of the Middle Passage as a child below decks is particularly revealing, stating, "The closeness of the place and the heat of the climate, added to the number in the ship, which was so crowded that each had scarcely room to turn himself, almost suffocated us. This produced copious perspirations, so that the air soon became unfit for respiration, from a variety of loathsome smells, and brought on a sickness among the slaves, of which many died, thus falling victims to the improvident avarice, as I may call it, of their purchasers. This wretched situation was again aggravated by the galling of the chains, now become insupportable, and the filth of the necessary tubs, into which the children often fell and were almost suffocated. The shrieks of the women and the groans of the dying rendered the whole a scene of horror almost inconceivable." In truth, even as a historian, there are little words that can be spoken after reading accounts like this. Phyllis, Lucy, and Aquiano's stories are the few that have words written or spoken directly from enslaved persons. For so many, many more, we're talking millions more, there is almost no evidence of what their lives in Africa as enslaved persons were like. Childhood as the early modern world knew it was varied, and you'll see just how varied in another module. But it left legacies that diverged during the 19th century into both movements for greater gender equality and individual freedoms, as well as movements to restrict individuals, especially girls. Roughly, the early modern period ends at 1800, give or take a few decades depending on country. That's it for childhood in early modern Europe and the American colonies. Stay tuned for another module on early modern childhood around the world. Thanks, y'all.